You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 90. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim and Sara Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
In this episode, we want to talk about relationships, aligning our relationships with God, with one another, our relationships in terms of being a leader. I think we can say that all of us look for relationships of mutual respect and love and care. Put that in a different way, we want relationships that aren't manipulative or where we're taken seriously and we aren't abused. What do healthy relationships look like for leaders? That's what we want to talk about today.
This episode of LeaderCast is brought to you by Dare to Lead, a training experience for Christian leaders to learn the skills you need to be a brave leader and create a courageous culture at church, at home, and in the workplace. It's one way Transforming Mission helps Jesus followers become courageous leaders. You can find resources for this episode, including a transformation guide at transformingmission.org/090. Did you know that when you become a LeaderCast Insider, you're the first to know when a new episode is available and that you automatically receive the transformation guide? Become a LeaderCast Insider today at transformingmission.org/090. Every Tuesday morning, you'll receive an email with a link to the new episode and the transformation guide when it is available. You can also subscribe to LeaderCast on your favorite podcast player. Transforming Mission exists to resource and coach you on the journey of becoming the courageous leader God created you to be. So in terms of the relationships that, Tim, you just identified, we all can stand in that place and know what we want to have and experience in relationships. And yet the other side of that is we've all experienced relationships that are either defensive or passive aggressive, or at a whole nother level, they're based on behaviors where people wear their armor and the expectation is you armor up to survive.
Sarah, when you use the words armored up, tell us what you mean.
Well, it's really a metaphor. So think about putting on your armor. Now, I don't know about you, Tim, but I don't have a suit of armor sitting in my literal closet, but it's a metaphor for the behaviors that we might exhibit. So think about things like perfectionism. So instead of healthy striving towards continual growth and improvement, we only focus on being perfect. The difference between healthy striving and perfectionism is it's only good enough if it's perfect. Perfectionism, that would be wearing your armor or armored leadership, versus daring leadership is the taking the perspective in both our relationships and our responsibilities of working towards continual growth and continual improvement of what we're doing. So perfectionism might be one. Focusing on scarcity might be another way that we armor up. Instead of looking at the abundance of resources that we have around us, we stay focused on what we don't have. Numbing and cynicism are a couple more behaviors for armored leadership. So if everything is met and every conversation that you have is riddled with cynicism, you may be armoring up. You may be leading from a place that I would call armored leadership. A couple other examples are hustling for your worth. So we see this one an awful lot in the life of the church. It's not just the life of the church. It happens everywhere. But hustling for your worth is really about, let me say it this way, you are a badge of honor if you work 70 plus hours a week. That's hustling for your worth. And someone who's quote unquote only working 40 isn't doing their part. And so it's this expectation that the more that you work, the more time that you put in, the better you are and the more that you're going to be rewarded. That's a form of armoring.
So before you go to another challenge, let me see if this is part of my armor, and that is if I'm not clearly focused with my purpose, and I'm feeling insecure, I have more. I may be more defensive, so I don't enter into conversations with vulnerability or transparency. I'm defending myself, and if I'm insecure, then I kind of want more to please people than I am about the God who's created me. And so those are places that I know that I armor up. Would those be examples?
I don't know that forgetting your purpose or ignoring your purpose is a form of armoring, unless you start to make it a weapon and you put fear into people that you're not focused on the purpose, and that becomes a weapon. Or you lead from a place of compliance and control. So if someone doesn't live into the mission in the way that you want them to live into the mission. So here, let's use this example because we talk about it several times on different episodes in terms of a discipleship pathway. So we have used the acronym of HOPE to stand for hospitality, offering Christ, practices, and engagement. If you've listened to any of those episodes, you've heard us talk about that as a framework. Those are 4 basic things that if you're seeking to follow Jesus and if you're seeking to be a courageous leader, you need to have all 4 of those aspects involved. Now, if it came to the place that you and I said, Tim, and I'm laughing a little bit because I can't ever imagine us doing this, that you have to talk about disciple making as hope, and you have to talk about it as hospitality, offering Christ, practices, and engagement. And here are the ways that each one of those things have to happen in your local context, and there is no other way. And we're going to evaluate you based on how we perceive that you have done what we've asked you to do. That would be compliance and control. It would also not be very Christian. So the daring leadership value in terms of what you were just speaking of might be cultivating commitment and a shared purpose. Does that make sense? I think the part of armoring up is there's a defensiveness to it and there's a fear to it. And so I don't know that ignorance or forgetting, I think where the forgetting might fall into place is the busy. That because you're focused on behavior that is, that exhaustion might be a status symbol, that would be armor. And because you're so exhausted, you're losing sight of what is happening with the purpose and how you should be relating to other people, that would be armor. The flip side of that for daring leadership would be modeling and supporting rest and play and recovery so that there is that white space, if I can say it that way, in our lives to connect with Jesus each and every day, to be reminded of our purpose, to stay grounded in the foundations of who God's inviting us to be as leaders.
So we've just talked about a couple of challenges. What are some other challenges to the healthy relationships that we are talking about?
Well, I think I just named one of the other challenges is forgetting that foundation. And we've talked about that in episode 89 and 88 in terms of what you were speaking to, Tim, of getting clarity about our purpose and staying focused on God's presence. If we're conflicted about any of that or the values that bring us to that place, we're going to have a hard time building relationships with people and being a leader who seeks to be in relationship with people. And one of the things that I have heard people say is, the Christian community that I am a part of has not taught me how to be in relationship with other people in a way that is based in mutuality and love and respect and kindness and all of the fruits of the Spirit. I haven't learned how to do that. And if our Christian communities aren't teaching us how to do that, it's unlikely we're going to learn that from the rest of the world.
When I think about what you just said, I really long to be a part of a community with the kind of relationships that we're talking about. That's not an indictment over the years of the churches or the communities that I've been a part of, but I have to intentionally seek out persons, whether they're in community or outside of community, just to be in relationship with me so I can be who I'm supposed to be. And it would be really nice if it just was a whole lot easier and people in the church would just act the way they're supposed to. That's not helpful, but those are some of the challenges we have to relationships.
And what I'm hearing you say, Tim, is there's this human longing to be in relationship. And I think in Christian community, and this doesn't have to be a formal part of a local church, but being a follower of Jesus, we long to be in relationship with people who are also followers of Jesus, who can help us continue to grow. And as people who are leading and trying to lead in ways that are courageous in the midst of the environment that we're living in right now that is filled with tension, filled with dichotomies, we need one another. And again, at the very same time, we've all been a part of those organizations and families and maybe even groups that the things that we've just been mentioning are what drives the family, what drives the organization, what is the norm for the group. And so we hope that today, as we walk through this episode, that we're going to model a different way of leading, and helping you to step into being able to stay focused and grounded in the foundations of God's presence and God's purpose, and then taking that next step to see the people around you as valuable, essential parts of you being a leader. And so in the midst of learning to lead in a different way and model a different way, part of what begins to happen is we begin to learn how to communicate in different ways and connect with people in different ways. And Tim, I know that I have been on the receiving end of something that you do each day, just as a way of reflecting on how are you living and leading as a follower of Jesus?
Sarah, I think you're talking about at the end of each day, and it may be early in the evening or it may be before I go to bed at night. I'm reflecting back upon the day about relationships that I've participated in, conversations that I've had, and just reflecting upon what's been said, what's not been said. Could I have said that better? I think I misunderstood something here. And then the way that gets lived out for me is that I make a note to either make a phone call, a text, an email the next day, and if it's not too late, might even do it that evening, of just saying, I think I misunderstood something, or I said something today that I hope that you took it the way I meant it. I've done those things. the one that I like doing the most is that sometimes I'll call people and just say, I need to tell you how much I appreciate you, how grateful I am for what you're doing, because you're helping me be who God would have me be. And the reason I like those is that it's much easier to thank somebody for their goodness than it is to say, I think we have a little misunderstanding and we need to take care of it. The way it's become a part of my life is that if I don't do it now, there's something missing in my life. So it's just a part of who I am to continue to be who I'm supposed to be. So is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and I think the essential why I wanted you to share that with folks is there's a piece of that is reflection, but also there's a piece of that moves you into providing feedback to other folks in a constructive way, and also reflecting on what was your part in what happened and what might you need to get clearer with others around. And I mean, let's face it, the basis of our relationships is communication, right? And so if we're stinking at our communication and we're not stepping back and saying, I'm not sure that was clear, or following up and saying thank you, we're probably not building and deepening the relationships with the people around us who are helping us to be the leaders that God's created us to be.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a specific time, and I'll blame it on my upbringing and the culture I grew up in, just being an Appalachian, and we had certain ways of saying things. The way it might be said and the way I was raised could very well be offensive to others. And as I've learned how it gets received, when for some reason, if I still kick into that, I'm usually going back to say, that's not really the way it was intended. It also closes a loop, because if I don't continue to cultivate those relationships, then there's something that gets, I'm going to use the word stunted in its growth at that point, that we don't go any farther. And whether anybody else thinks that or not, I still have it in my mind, so that when I'm in the presence of that person or I'm talking to them, I'm still thinking maybe they've taken what I've said in a negative way, which I didn't intend for it to be. So then I get tentative, and so I'm not being vulnerable, and I'm not being truthful. And so it's kind of like working around something that I could have taken care of very easily just by saying, this is what was said, this is what was meant. Let's move on. And
so with what Tim's been sharing in mind, let me outline for you 4 reminders as you're seeking to build relationships with people. And the first reminder is from our previous 2 episodes. So Tim, you want to remind us what we were talking about in terms of that foundation?
Being clear about our purpose, being focused on purpose, and being aware of the presence of God, being able to identify the presence of God.
And so, once again, think about those 2 things as setting the foundation for everything that we're going to talk about that follows. The first is as you seek to build relationships, to think about sitting next to people and not sitting across from them. And again, this may be more of a metaphor than literally, because if you're thinking about your kitchen table at dinner and there's 4 of you and there are 4 sides of a table, it's likely that there are people sitting across from one another. So this might not literally be taking place, but think about when you have met with someone who is sitting behind a desk and you're sitting across from them, across that desk. What ends up happening in terms of the relationship that is there? What's communicated when someone sits behind a desk?
If you're asking me, then if I'm sitting behind the desk and somebody's sitting on the other side, I've put myself in a position of power or superiority, and what I'm doing is issuing, just by the way we're sitting. I think it shows that we're not on equal terms in the relationship.
Yeah, that there's somehow a power relationship going on. And
Right.
So if you're seeking to build relationships with people, it's probably not going to be a great way to either start a relationship or deepen a relationship if that's how it's happening. So think about sitting next to people, both physically and metaphorically, that how are you coming alongside people and being present to them in the same way that you want to be present to. So are you hearing what the people that you might be speaking to are saying, and is there a give and take in the midst of that?
So, Sarah, with what you're saying, most of the people who, if we're thinking of my office, most of the people that come into my office don't sit across the desk from me. We end up sitting at a little round table where we are next to each other. I try to take the barrier out of the way.
Yeah.
So I think that's what you're talking about.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. So you have two choices in your office. You could choose to sit behind your desk, and that conversation is likely going to be very different than what you just described as sitting around a round table with other people. The second reminder is to own your part. And that's part of what you were illustrating, Tim, as you were talking about your end of the day reflection of what's my part. And even if your part is a small part in what is happening, that following up and circling back to someone to say, I think you misunderstood me, and I want to make sure that we're clear. Because if that doesn't happen, what can happen is a wedge gets driven between the two of you in your relationship, and you might constantly be thinking about, that wasn't said the way that I wanted it to be said, or how I said it was not received in the way that it was intended, and you're doubting yourself each time you're in interaction with that person, or you're making up stories of what the other person might be thinking, saying, or how they're responding to you. And I know that there have been times that I have said to you, Tim, if my face looks like I'm grimacing at you, I have a headache. I'm not really grimacing at you. And so, you might interpret, not you literally, but the person that you're in relationship with might interpret the look on their face, their facial expressions, their demeanor in one way, and it has absolutely nothing to do with you. And so you're making yourself the center of their story, and you never even stop to ask, is everything okay? And that all happens because you haven't stopped to own your part and to reflect on what your part is. And Tim, I'm sure you have something to say about this. The only other thing that I want to say is, even when you think you don't have a part, you have a part. And I say that because if you think you don't have a part of what you have taken responsibility for is not saying or doing anything. And that's your part.
I can't say it any better than what you've said it. I mean, that's part of, if we go back to my reflection at the end of the day, part of just going back over and even having contact with somebody else is to continue to build a positive relationship. And so my part in that relationship is to take the initiative to keep it healthy, whether it's on my end or whether it's to continue to get the real story instead of the story I've made up, to get the real story so that it's healthy on the end of the person that with whom I want to be in relationship.
Are we ready for the third reminder?
I am.
So the third reminder is to recognize your strengths and the strengths of others. So why would this be important in developing and nurturing relationships? You all know that I coach with Clifton Strengths, and I use that tool to help identify people's strengths. And we'll give you, in the transformation guide for this episode, some questions if you haven't taken that assessment or don't have any desire to, that you might consider in terms of your own strengths or the strengths of the people that are around you. And so these questions would be questions that you would ask them, not that you would seek to answer for them. But part of that is we are at our best and offer our best when we are living and leading from our strengths. We can make a greater impact when we're leading others from our strengths and when we're in relationship with people who recognize our strengths and allow us to be who God has created us to be, and we're doing the same for them. So this may, let's not have a conversation about our strategic strength, Tim, because both you and I have that one, and it might be hard for the folks that are listening to listen to us both talk about the same strength. But one of the strengths that I know that you lead with is it's the futuristic talent. And part of the beauty of that strength and the beauty of leading with that strength is that you are thinking down the road, and not only thinking, but seeing down the road. Now, I have that strength, but it's farther down on my list. One of my top 5 that I poke fun at myself more often than not for having is called maximizer. And so I am always seeking to make things better. It's about taking things from being good to being great. So I'm not great if something is horrible and you want me to make it good, but I can be really good and I can offer a lot if it's good and you want it to be amazing.
So let me jump in and see if I can illustrate that. And it may not be as clear for everyone. But those of you who heard our last podcast, episode 89, I'm not going to talk about content, because every time we have put a podcast together and the content that goes into it and the editing and everything that works, Sarah's the one who makes it sound unbelievably good. The content, I'm not going to give her total credit because I helped with some of that. But the last podcast we had, we needed to have our recording done before we got back to Columbus after we had been a part of a weekend retreat. And so we decided we would record the podcast while driving back in the car. Those of you who have heard the podcast, and if you haven't, you need to go back for the content, but you can hear that the quality is not quite the same. And when you hear that the quality is not quite the same, I want you to know how hard Sarah worked, not only to get the quality up, but even to the point of saying, I think we need to do that podcast again, not because of the content, but because she could make it so much better. Part of that is her strength of maximizer, because everything we do at Transforming Mission and everything she does as a coach is top quality, top drawer. And it's because every time she does it, the next question she asks herself is, how can I make this better. And so in our conversation about putting out the last podcast, I just had to say, I think people will like the idea that there's a little difference to it. It'll give it some character. Now, if it didn't, don't email us or tell or text us or let us know. But if it did, let us know that you enjoyed it so that we can continue to move on and make things even better. Is that an example of your maximizer?
Yes, and you all can't see me laughing here, and I'm trying not to laugh in the microphone as Tim is talking because he nailed it. And so I want to go back to something where we began in terms of what can get in the way of relationships. Part of why I'm laughing is when, Tim, you said, Sara, I don't know that we need to redo the episode. I think it's okay. It's only one episode. That is not, that has not been our standard. There is a time in my life that I would have insisted that we re-record that episode because it was not perfect and it was about being perfect. What I have come to understand is the maximizer talent, it's not about being perfect. It's about offering something of quality and making something even better than it has been. And so, yeah, there are times that I'm like, yeah, I probably won't listen to that episode again because I've listened to it and I know it could be better. But I didn't go down the slippery slope of needing it to be perfect and armoring up in that instance. Because part of what I have come to appreciate about the relationship that you and I have, Tim, is that you can say things like that to me, and I know, okay, calm down, maximizer. It is okay. It will be fine. It is only 30 minutes of my life and anybody's life who listens to it.
But it's a good podcast. The content is excellent. So I want to encourage people to go back. You can listen to it and then laugh at the background noise. I think the challenge that we're talking about, though, is if you're going to lead with your strengths, you have to know what your strengths are. And if you're going to lead with your strengths, you need to know the strengths of the people around you if you're working together so that there's a complementary piece about what you do well and what somebody else can do well and how those fit together for the best as you live into the purpose that you're that drives you forward.
Right, because the relationships that I have with the people around me, including you, Tim, I know that they help temper my maximizer talent. And I need that. So I need you to both recognize that, yes, that's part of who I am and part of what my strengths are, but I also need you to help me keep that in check because it can get out of control. And all of our talents can get out of control and go to extremes. If Tim was only always living 5 years down the road and was never present in today, that would be the underbelly of the futuristic talent that I was talking about. And he would need someone to call him back to the present and saying, hello, nope, we're still in 2019. We're not yet to 2025. Let's focus here. You don't do that, but just an example of how another talent can be turned upside down and work against itself. So recognize the strengths that you have and the strengths of others, and that will help you to build relationships. And what I often end up saying to folks about that is, as you share your strengths with other people and let them know who you are, and you begin to recognize the strengths of others, it's a win-win for both of you. And your relationship is going to continue to deepen and strengthen because both of you, or an entire group of people, can be who God has created you to be. And that's a beautiful thing to watch unfold and watch happen. Ready for number 4?
Let's go.
The fourth reminder and the last reminder is to model vulnerability and openness. So I think, Tim, we may have just done that in what we were talking about around our strengths.
I think we just modeled it.
And so staying open to that feedback. And let me remind you that vulnerability isn't about bleeding all over the place and indiscriminate sharing. It's the emotion that we experience in times of uncertainty. It's the emotion that we experience when we are not sure of what is going to happen, and yet we continue to step into it. And so when we talk about rumbling with vulnerability, we're talking about stepping into that and being present to that, so that you can model that openness that we've been talking about.
And when you've talked about armoring up, that's really not living into your vulnerability.
Right. You nailed it.
You're a good teacher.
As you think about taking action on this episode, what we'd like to invite you to do is two things. One, you can download the transformation guide for this episode, where we'll remind you of the 4 things that we have talked about today in terms of sitting next to people, owning your part, recognizing strengths, and modeling vulnerability. But we'll also unpack those a little bit more so that you can be in conversation with the people that you're in relationship with to strengthen those relationships and how you are communicating and being present to one another. The second thing that we want to invite you to do is to stop and ask yourself the question, who do you need to sit next to that you're currently sitting across from?
So Sarah, there are ways that we can practice that, because it's not literally sitting across a desk, but be aware, even at, I've heard you say this before, even at family gatherings, just be aware with whom you're sitting next to, even though there's somebody sitting across the table from you. Be aware of the relationship and the proximity of people around you. That might be at work, and the way that you interact with people. Be aware of how you want to have people, that you come alongside of people in developing the relationship and not trying to keep people at arm's distance. That's what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So who is one person that you need to come alongside that you've been keeping at a distance?
So, Tim, final thoughts on this episode?
Well, Sarah, I began to reflect upon some things that I've already said in this episode. And one of the things is that little pattern that I have in the evenings, I actually got that from John Wesley. Somewhere in my Wesley studies, I learned that Wesley did an evening reflection. Now, I'm not sure that I'm doing it the way Wesley did it, but that stuck with me, and I can remember the time that I said to myself, I need to stop every day and look back over the day with prayer, with scripture, with relationships, and find out if I'm actually becoming more who God created me to be. And so this whole episode has been about how do we align our relationships with one another and with God, so that we can be the leaders that are needed at this point in time in history. So I hope, as people have listened, that they've gotten some direction on how to be a leader that makes a difference in today's world.
So all I have to remind you of is that you can find show notes for this episode along with a transformation guide at transformingmission.org/090. So go lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.